The purpose of this video is to walk through an example of the full voice showcase just for clarity so that you guys can see what I expect to see when you're submitting your final this week. So I'm just going to run through really quickly the 3 key items that I should see on your voice showcase final, and I'm running through these based on the assignment sheet, which you can find in the LMS. So the first thing is your actual piece that you're writing. This is the draft that you turned in last week, the draft that I'm working on getting feedback for you guys. It's just that creative piece, that passion piece, just whatever it is that you want to use that you've written to analyze how your voice sounds. Ideally, you'll have a length of around 2 pages double spaced of content to look at, but you'll notice in my example that mine's a little bit shorter. It's okay if yours is about a page and a half, but the more content that you have to work with, the easier it actually is to write that 2-paragraph analysis of your voice. The second thing that you'll want to make sure you have is a minimum of 2 paragraphs analyzing your voice, and those paragraphs should at least cover these 3 questions. What makes your writing recognizable as yours? Like, how do you know that you wrote a thing? Imagine you hand wrote something in the same style as everybody else in your class. You all have the same handwriting, and your teacher's like, 6 people forgot to put their names on it. How would you know which one you wrote other than just the recollection of having written it? How do you know that that's your writing? Something else you can cover in this section is how do your choices in tone, word choice, basically diction, and style reflect your personality or perspective. You'll see in the example how I work to answer that, and that might spark some ideas for you as well. And what patterns or habits do you notice in the way you write? Additionally, I'll mention that in the example that I share. I also want you to use examples from your showcase piece to illustrate your points. So in this part of part 2, I want you to quote yourself as things to point to say, here, show the quote, here I sound passionate, or here I sound angry, or whatever. And then the third part of this is a reflection, and that reflection, remember, is specifically responding to those questions that I shared this week. Now that your final is due, you can find them in the LMS in the book section. It says something like reflection questions for Unit 1. If you can't find them, let me know. I'll point you in the right direction. Okay, so let me walk through an example, and I will post a link to this example as well so that you can go through it if you prefer. What I did here is I cheated a little bit. I grabbed something that I wrote a while ago, but that had a particular voice that I was going for, something that I'd be able to then come through and analyze. While this was written for an academic setting, it's a little bit more on the personal side, so I felt like this was a good thing to show y'all, but I do admit that I didn't write something new for this example, and you'll see how that comes up later. So what this is an acknowledgments section for my master's thesis. It's just basically the part that's like, thank you for inspiring me, thank you for helping me, thank you my family and friends, that part of it. Mine is super short. It was like less than a full page. So that's what I did. I put this here. Now the voice showcase, that's the thing you guys have been kind of working on last week. It's the piece that you're cultivating a voice for, writing something that you are interested in writing. Maybe that's, working with one of the quote free writes, or just writing something fresh, whatever you have wanted to write, you put that there. There's no requirement here for perfection. There's no requirement for perfect grammar. There's no educational, analytical requirement. You just write whatever you want, as we've talked about. So the part that's kind of fresh this week that you'll want to work on finalizing up as you turn in this whole project is your voice analysis. The reflection should come pretty straightforward for you, but it's really this part two that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, just so y'all are clear on what I'm hoping for and what you can do in your part two of this project. So I want 2 paragraphs. I stuck to 2 paragraphs. I probably could have written more. Had my showcase been longer, I think I would have been able to write a little bit more, but my voice is pretty consistent throughout. So what I did is I approached this voice analysis section in 2 parts. So the first paragraph, I just focused on describing my voice. Like, what does my voice sound like in part one? And then in the second paragraph, that's where I focused on answering these specific questions here. I could have approached this as, 3 paragraphs, one for each of these questions, but I, again, didn't have a ton of content to work with, so that felt like it might have been stretching it a little bit. So the first thing I did is I identified how my voice sounds. I mentioned appreciative, but specifically that it's genuine and there's an undertone of humor. So I would encourage you to do that as well. Just generally, how does your voice sound in the piece that you've shared here? And then I explain it. I do a thing that I like to call over-explaining, and I want y'all to do as much of that as you can when you're reflecting and writing an analysis, is over-explain for me. Now, some of y'all have mentioned that your writing is more straightforward. You just like to get to the point. So over-explaining might feel fluffy. It might feel like you're saying the same thing a number of times, but really what you're doing is digging into the details so that you can develop your idea, develop your explanation. So do what might feel like over-explaining, and that's exactly what I want you to do. As I explain how my voice sounds, I kind of chunk out each element. So I explain that, of course, the nature of this project is that I'm going to sound appreciative because it's a thank you note, basically. But I do also say that my voice is genuine, and I point out really where I feel like that rings true when I say phrases like, for which there are not words enough, just life in general. There's something in there, and I explain that here, that adds some sort of depth. It's not just like, thanks, appreciate it, bye. It's you made a significant impact on me, and I can, my tone of just like overwhelming appreciation in these phrases is visible there. I also talk about that third point where I say my voice is humorous. So in this paragraph, I'm trying to make sure that I'm covering all of the ways in which I've described my voice, and I'm trying to give examples from that showcase piece to support the reason why I've said this is my voice. So the third thing I mention is that I sound a little humorous. I mentioned that one of my professors may have created a monster, and obviously that's a hyperbole. Hopefully no one would say that I'm a monster, but there's something there that's kind of like so absurd that it's funny within that hyperbole. So there's something that just sort of leaves the tone of formality for a minute, leaves the appreciative tone, and makes a funny comment, and then goes right back. And so what I do in this section is I just am working to spend a paragraph describing how my voice sounds and supporting that with examples and explanations. Now, y'all are familiar with this. You've been working on this last week when you did activity 4. And so, you can kind of go back to those questions that I've asked you before. How do you think you sound? Why do you think you sound like this? That's what I want you to put in here. The second paragraph, again, remember, I want it to have 2 paragraphs. So the second paragraph is me just trying to answer all of these questions in part 2. The first question, what makes your writing recognizable as yours? I respond to that here, and I spend sort of the first part of my paragraph covering the first and the third question. What patterns or habits do you notice in the way you write? What makes your writing recognizable as yours? to be honest, those are kind of asking the same question. So writing holistically, don't feel like you have to, you know, answer each question individually. Providing a holistic response to all these questions is going to cover it, and I do that here. So I say I can tell that this writing belongs to me not only due to the personal connections, but for two key writing aspects. One, I often work commas into my writing. So I went back and I noticed I have a lot of this tendency to start with a dependent clause, put a comma, and then put an independent clause, or even interrupt myself while I'm talking with an interjection, and I put a lot of commas in my writing. So I notice that feels like just a key habit that I have, a key trait of my writing style. So I'm answering questions one and three there, and then with the question about tone, word choice, style reflect my personality. I kind of talk about this a lot. I mentioned the idea that I understand that the writing I do is in a formal space, but personally I don't feel terribly formal most of the time. I prefer to go with like a playful professionalism in my day-to-day life. And I think I see that, with my connection to humor. And so I just explain that, my personality is in there. Now, certainly, and I mentioned this in my reflection, this took a little bit of stretching. Like, I had to think for a minute of what I'm going to say, and you'll probably feel that way too. I've been writing about writing for decades now, so it's a little more natural for me to do it. It's okay if it doesn't come right away. It certainly didn't for me. It wasn't the easiest thing to write, so it makes sense that it might take you some thinking. And then part 3 is me responding to those reflection questions. I think there's like 4 or 5 of them, and again, I took more of a question by question approach here, but I believe I did kind of blend those first 2 questions together. And really in the reflection, I'm not necessarily trying to be analytical. I'm just trying to answer the questions honestly, whereas in part 2, I was trying to be a little bit more academically analytical. So if I had to explain sort of how you should go about each of these 3 components, the first one is just writing anything for the sake of writing as close to 2 pages as you can, just so you have content to analyze. Ideally make it uniform so that you have some kind of key purpose, but your showcase is just the piece of writing we're going to look at. Part 2 is probably the most academically formal that you'll get in this entire project. It's where you're giving me this analytical description, and 2 paragraphs in logical paragraph form, and then part 3 can just be any style of reflection. I just naturally write slightly more formal. I'm used to just writing grammatically correct sentences. It's hard for me to not have periods in the middle of my sentences, but if in your reflection you were just talking into your phone, answering the questions with your thoughts, and having it dictate that for you, that would be perfectly fine. I don't care at all in the reflection about grammar. I just kind of took it one question at a time, and then where I could, I over-explained my thoughts on the topic that I was on the question I was responding to. So that's how you can approach that. But I just wanted to offer this to y'all. I know this class is so fast, and this part of the project is sort of brushed through, and so that we can get on to the next project, but I wanted to give y'all an example and something just to kind of ease your mind if you have questions of, am I doing this right or not? So this is here. Y'all will start to see the feedback on your showcase pieces coming through. If you've already added a reflection or a part 2 voice analysis, then I will give you feedback on that as well. But otherwise, just email me if you have any questions.